evening. Welcome, everyone. I'm Cynthia Gandy Zinneber. It's always wonderful to see such a great crowd. Good way to start the weekend, I think. The first thing I want to do is to thank and show appreciation for our underwriters and our partner. And I want to say their names, and when I'm finished, I hope all of you who are here tonight will stand up. The first one is the Bank of Tampa. Cecile Bayer is here representing the bank. Trevor Lampier is here representing the Beck Group. The Museum Society is represented by Elizabeth Harris, the president, and Suzanne Ennis, vice president. And of course, Sandy Reef is here with the Frankie Duckwall Foundation. We also have Hillward Henderson, Franklin Street, and Beach Bank. And we have one partner, the Poynter Institute. We have 3 representatives from Poynter: Tina DeAcon, Deborah Reed, and Andrew DeLong. Will you all please stand? Thank you so much. I think all of you are probably well acquainted with Dr. Charles McGraw Groh. This is the second time he has been a guest curator for a pretty blockbuster show, I think. But before he begins his talk, I really have a very exciting announcement to make. And that is our first endowment in the history of the museum, and that is since 1933, has recently been created by one of our volunteers who is with us tonight on the front row in turquoise, Dr. Mona Gardner. Mona has worked every week for over 12 years doing research in our archives, and that placed her immediately next to Susan Carter for 12 years every week. And Mona was so impressed with Susan's work ethic, her dedication, her professionalism, that she decided to create an endowment in Susan's honor, and it is called the Susan Vassiloff Carter Lecture Series. This is the first of many. This endowment will be in perpetuity, and we will have at least one lecture each year. So please join me in thanking Mona and recognizing Susan. Yay! It's very exciting. Thank you so much. Now, Charles. Charles, are you here? I thought I saw you. Oh, there you are, first row. As you probably know, Charles is a professor of history at the University of Tampa, and his special research has been in the Spanish-American War. He's agreed to entertain a few questions after his short talk, and the title is The Rocking Chair Report, War Stories from the Tampa Bay Hotel. Thank you, Charles.
Well, welcome everybody. It's nice to see you. I hope you had a chance to take a look at the exhibit. We're very excited about it. And before I start, I just want to say, first of all, thank you to Cynthia for the opportunity to continue this collaboration. It's been just so wonderful. And I so appreciate your commitment to conversations that I think very much put us at the center of kind of community in terms of things that are relevant, right? Like ways that we can look at the past that very much inform today. I couldn't be more thrilled. I also want to say how excited I am to be the first speaker in this series that's named after somebody who I adore working with. In addition to everything that was said before that was so fabulous, Susan is responsible for the incredible loans that you see as part of this exhibit. There was so much work done to actually get this really rare material here to Tampa for 10 months. And so I hope everybody knows really how special that actually is. And finally, and then I promise this will not be the Academy Awards, you won't have to pull me away. I want to thank Nora Armstrong, who I think is always our unsung hero. Nora, actually, I've had the opportunity to work with now for 2 years, and I kind of call her our MacGyver because she can make anything beautiful, starting with anything. And particularly for this exhibit where you see these reproductions of old newspapers, right? That's Nora. And so I want to say thank you so much for making this so beautiful. Yeah. Okay, anyway, so one of the things that you'll notice on the program is that a very exciting part about this exhibit is that we have a wealth of programs that are going to be taking place over the next 10 months to deal with so many different facets of the exhibit in more detail. It's an astonishing lineup of speakers. So I hope you will continue to take part in an ongoing conversation. What that also means is I don't have to do that much tonight. Obviously, there's so much. And so what I really wanted to do to just, give us a start was to center Tampa in the conversation, right? There is so much that we can talk about by nature of being in what was the Tampa Bay Hotel. And so I want to specifically draw your attention to that. So I think it's so important that we recognize that the War for Cuban Independence, which was really the third war for Cuban independence that began in 1895, had really profound consequences for Tampa and its large Cuban community. In 1898, once the U.S. intervenes in that conflict, it has even more consequences for Tampa. There's so much that we can't deal with. It's so central to, I think there's few things that we can talk about in Tampa that are as important as this conflict. There's so many different exhibits we could do on this one subject. I think that what I can say is, for our purposes, in terms of talking about journalism, this event put Tampa in a national spotlight, okay? For the first time, people across the country are looking at Tampa. And so I want to talk a little bit about what they were saying, and what people in Tampa were concerned about whether or not they were going to say. So let me start off, and I want to actually start off before the war with something that you see in the exhibit, because I think it's so important to recognize that Henry Plant has a big part in what is probably one of the most famous stories of yellow journalism. And so this is something that occurs a year prior to the U.S. intervention. So if you were walking around the room, hopefully you notice that in 1897, William Randolph Hearst sent Richard Harding Davis and Frederick Remington to Cuba to document the War of Independence against Spain. And as we talked about in the exhibit, they had originally planned, they arrived on the Olivet, they had planned, which is Henry Plant's steamship, they'd planned to stay for a month. Remington did not like it. It was arduous, it was difficult, and so he decided to go home. Right? Now, obviously, there's this famous story about, Hearst, the exchange. If you want to talk about that in questions and answer, we can do that. I'll furnish the war thing, okay? But what I want to focus you on is simply the fact that Remington left, okay? But he continued to draw illustrations that are supposedly firsthand, right? But he's not actually in Cuba. Right. So in any case, at the end of Richard Harding Davis's stay, he leaves, he is on the Olivet, and while he is there, there was a search that was conducted on 3 Cuban women who were believed to be revolutionary supporters, right, who were carrying information out of Cuba. They'd already been searched once prior to getting on the vessel, and then they were searched once again. Now, Richard Harding Davis knew that they were actually searched by a female matron in private, but he was really ambiguous about that in the story that was published in the New York Journal. And then, unbeknownst to him, Richard Harding Davis provided an illustration that you're looking at here. That was a problem. And it was one that was very quickly exposed as a problem. The New York World, which was in competition with the Journal, interviewed one of the women in order to be able to debunk the story. It has a lot of consequences for perceptions of truth in the context of this particular moment. Now, the reason why I'm kind of introducing this to you, even though you might have saw it in the room, is that Henry Plant talked about it. All right. So he was actually in Jamaica at the time that the story was released, but obviously when he comes back, he's a little horrified. And if you read the whole story, Richard Harding Davis spends a lot of time critiquing Plant, including his color scheme for his ship. Apparently he doesn't like yellow, which is funny for a yellow journalist. So in any case, Plant was very painstaking in finding out exactly what had happened, which was something that also appeared in the press. And I have this quote about Richard Harding Davis from Henry Plant that I thought you might enjoy. "I have only to say that he appears to have a loose method of expressing himself. And his terms with reference to the captain, myself, and others appear to be especially unguarded." I think that was quite civil, actually. But in any case, one of the reasons why I think it's important to focus on this story is that it certainly set in motion, I think, some of the perceptions of people in Tampa about what it meant to have correspondents, kind of focusing their gaze. It's also really interesting, if you follow the Tampa paper, they never say anything nice about Richard Harding Davis again. And I think that that's really interesting. I have this quote from the Tampa Bay Tribune from the next year. It says, "The Indiana electrician who has invented a camera that will photograph the mind might ruin his instrument if he tried it on Richard Harding Davis." So in any case, let's turn our attention to 1898. And I'm going to make this discussion very, very kind of encapsulated, but I think, again, I'm just kind of reminding a lot of people of what they already know, which is that with the U.S. declaration of war and the selection of Tampa as the point of embarkation, right, there is just an astonishing change that happens in the context of this city, right? Think about, 30,000 troops converging in Tampa, right? Obviously, people know the story of Teddy Roosevelt. We've talked about Clara Barton. And when I say it was transformative for Tampa, it brought about $3 million into Tampa. $3 million was actually worth something in 1898. Right? And so, again, when I say that it really forever kind of puts Tampa on the map, that's something that's very true. Now, people, I think, benefited unequally from this. One of the things that I'm really fascinated about coming off an exhibit talking about Tampa's black community is that the arrival of 4 African-American Army regiments actually brought a lot of dollars into black businesses and seems to have given a huge boost to that particular community at the time. But as I said, there was no way really that the city could be prepared for what was necessary, nor was the Army itself prepared either. And so I think it's really important that we recognize that. So Port Tampa, I think I say up here, was chosen because it was actually the closest port to Havana. And there was a perception that the bay offered protection from Spanish vessels. The problem is, if you're actually at the port, There's about 10 miles separating the port. It's like 10 miles of sand from like anywhere you want to connect it to. Warehouses, railroad stations, et cetera. And there's one track that the plant system runs along those 10 miles. Think about that as provisioning these 30,000 troops. So it's not surprising what happens, which is that trainloads of food, clothing, weapons were backed up as far as Columbia, South Carolina. Right? And there was a rivalry that was going on between the plant system and the other line that served Tampa. And of course, only the plant system owns that 10 miles. And so they weren't sharing, and so the military actually threatened to take over. Clearly there's some growing pains that are being exercised here. I think we all know the story of what happens to soldiers, right? There's these tent camps that are kind of basically they're located in all different parts of Tampa. And we have folks that are in wool. It's summer. They're not provisioned. They are hot, they are humid, they have dysentery, they suffer from disease. It's a really difficult experience. I said there's a lot of business success, there's some business problems. Saloons do really well, prostitution does really well, right? You know, and so it brings a lot of problems to Tampa along with success. I also mentioned briefly here that because of this kind of gathering together of people, Tampa actually sees the worst race riot that occurs during the war. There were volunteers from Ohio that actually started doing target practice using a 2-year-old Afro-Cuban child. And then when the African-American regiments basically protested, it resulted in a huge riot involving a variety of different soldiers that caused quite a lot of injury. So the reason why I'm kind of telling you this, besides the fact that it's so important to our history, is that when we look at how Tampa is being reported, right, there's a lot of stuff that's going on. You know? So the first story that I told you was very much about yellow journalism, right? Something that's clearly fabricated. I think as we move forward and we look at this Tampa stage, what we kind of refer to as the rocking chair period, right? I think it's more nuanced than that. You know? So I'm just going to take you through in just a minute or two a kind of couple of possibilities here. So the first thing, obviously, are the war correspondents at the hotel. I hope you had a chance to look at this album, this autograph album, which is actually from the Henry B. Plant Museum collection, which has all of these signatures and illustrations from different reporters and artists that were here at the hotel. It's on the iPad. If you didn't have a chance, please go back. It's so exciting. But the thing that I can say, you see a quote here from George Kennan, a nearly full moon was just rising over the trees on the eastern side of the hotel park, touching with silver the drifts of white blossoms on dark masses of oleander tress in the foreground, and flooding with soft yellow lights the domes, Moorish arches, and long facade of the, excuse me, I think there's a typo, it should say white, the whole immense building, so this is pretty typical. People love staying in the Tampa Bay Hotel, right? Correspondents loved staying in the Tampa Bay Hotel. And if that's basically your focus on Tampa, it's like the most wonderful place on earth, right? It's a playground, and that's how they talk about it. They sip tea, they sit on the veranda, right? And this is where this whole term, kind of the rocking chair war, actually comes from. They talk about reunions, they share war stories. What they don't do is a lot of news, right? You know, and Richard Harding Davis actually says, and again, notice the irony here, that there were reporters that were just making stuff up and like sending it to New York. But I tell you, I can't actually find a lot of that, you know. I think what is much more typical is the fact that they don't have a lot that they're willing to report. okay? And so that's what I would really kind of draw your attention to. And before I comment more on that, let me just say something about Tampa as a whole. They didn't like it. They didn't like it. All right, I repeated this photo for Eric. All right, so they didn't like it. They describe it as basically dirt, sand, hot, nothing. Right? Okay. You know, and that was something that was really horrifying to business leaders in Tampa. So there was a concerted effort on the part of Peter Knight, other business leaders, to really try and kind of court them. Right? So they organized this whole trip where they would take people around to what they saw as Tampa's highlights. It's so funny too, Tampa's highlights apparently were breweries, cigars, and fine cuisine. That's what we do. Again, I don't think that's fake news. So again, I think that became a really kind of rough experience, as I said, for locals. Now, the other thing that, and this is the last slide here, I think what you do notice with the correspondence, and I think it's so important to look at Tampa because it sets in motion what happens when they're actually in Cuba, okay? They are intermixed in the hotel with these Army officers. They have to have passes in order to actually report on the war, approved by the Army, okay? So it is incumbent upon them to actually be favored by military officials. All right? And so that has a huge role in what actually happens, right? I think genuinely, if you look at Davis, if you look at a number of people, they genuinely have admiration, I think, for the regular units in their organization that are in Tampa. By the way, you'll also notice there's a lot of Frederick Remington sketches in our exhibit, which I think are extraordinary. We're so grateful to have these loans. Frederick Remington really documented every aspect of Army life here in Tampa. It's an incredible record, and you have the opportunity here to compare these, little hand sketches to finished illustrations, and so please don't miss that opportunity. But so a lot of genuine regard. At the same time, though, I think there was also a lot of concern that they would not be able to go to Cuba if they said the wrong thing. Right? And so that very much manifests itself. Another thing that happened early on, they were actually taking advantage of their cocktail conversations to basically leak secrets about, transports to Cuba. And so the military actually instituted censorship, right? So their stories actually had to have a censor stamp. And so that's another reason why lots of stories are not coming out of Tampa. Okay, so how this actually breaks is what you see here as the Bigelow-Davis controversy. And so basically what happens is that Portney Bigelow, who is a reporter who I do think really kind of rivals Davis in celebrity, he publishes this article in Harper's Weekly where he basically tells you all the bad stuff I told you. Okay, he just goes down this list, right? It's quite an expose. And what happens after shouldn't surprise you. He was widely attacked by every American correspondent. There were some European correspondents that were willing to actually step up in his defense, but he was widely attacked. He lost his credentials, okay? And then I think the important thing is that ultimately he was vindicated, right? This was actually really excellent reporting. But not something that people were willing to deal with in the context of the moment. Now, this is where Davis, I think, becomes really interesting. If you look at his private letters, he basically said that everything that Bigelow said was right. By this point, they hated each other, so I don't know if he ever would have said that publicly. But he said that he definitely couldn't say it publicly, which is, again, I think, a really interesting statement. The last thing that I'll tell you about that is basically, again, the view from Tampa. It's really interesting after this exchange took place. So Bigelow publishes the expose. Davis leads the attack against him in an article that's published in the New York Herald. The Tampa paper weighs in on the side of Bigelow, which again, I think is really interesting. They're like, yes, this is exactly what's happening here, right? There's like tons of problems here, you know? And so I think that's really interesting, and I'll kind of leave you with the last thing that they say about it. The Tribune is not without an opinion upon the interesting subject, but its expression might be deemed treasonable. We prefer to look as wise as Richard Harding Davis imagines himself to be. I'm telling you, they do not like him. All right. As Richard Harding Davis imagines himself to be, saw wood and say nothing. And I'll leave you with that. So, I'm supposed to take a few questions. I don't know what a few is. Hi.
Is it true that some of the soldiers that were here were recruited out in San Antonio, Texas, at a bar behind Alamo? I had a drink in that bar and hailed with the story. He swore it was true.
I have no knowledge, but I desperately want it to be true. So let's go with that, right? We're calling it true, yeah. Anything else I can validate for you? Okay. Yeah, this is actually, I think, a really interesting story, right? And you can read, I think, about some of this in the exhibit itself. But that story actually isn't invented until a couple of years later than when it supposedly happened. There is a Canadian correspondent who in 1901 basically published the supposed cable exchange that took place between Frederick Remington and William Randolph Hearst, where Remington said, "I want to leave, there's no war," which, by the way, this is stupid because there's war all over Cuba. Okay, there already was a war, okay? So the whole idea that one needed to be furnished in the first place is just think about this, okay? But so he supposedly says, I want to come home because, there's nothing going on, okay? Not like I'm really hating every aspect of this, which is what actually happened, okay? But then supposedly Remington came, Richard Harding, oh goodness, go through the list, sorry. William Randolph Hearst cables back and says, "You furnish the pictures, I'll furnish the war," okay? Now, again, if you read through the panels, what you'll know is that this Canadian reporter was actually in Europe at the time that this exchange supposedly took place. There is no surviving evidence of this exchange, and everybody involved said, no, this did not happen, okay? But what I think is so interesting about this, all right, and I'm supposed to leave happy, I'm sorry, I might not gonna pull this off. What I think is really interesting about this is a really important story about American myth making, okay? So think about this. In 1901, what is happening, okay? The United States finds itself in the position that Spain was in a couple of years earlier, right? So the United States declared war against Spain over Cuba and invaded the Philippines. Okay? And then basically took the Philippines as a colony. And the Filipinos who went to war against the Spanish in 1896, which was why the Spanish was fighting this two-front war, declared war on the United States to gain their independence, right? And the United States pretty much did everything that the Spanish did in Cuba. They set up civilian detention centers, right? They committed, you'll see in the exhibit, water torture, right? And there's this cartoon in the exhibit that really fascinates me. That is basically this torture and these European powers sitting back going, yeah, you're just like us, right? And so what's so important about this is that people in 1901, 1902 are trying to make sense of what's happened, right? And one of the things that becomes very popular is to blame it on the press, right? It was fake news that pushed people in this particular direction. It was a gullible public that got rabid, right? And it was a weak president who responded to public opinion. Now, none of these things actually appear to be true. There's no evidence that public opinion influenced American foreign policy, right? But it was a story that helped people to figure out what it means for the United States to go from being the colony that achieved independence to the place that has colonies. So that's where that whole story that, again, Hearst is responsible actually seems to come from. Which is, I think, again, something for us all to think about. Like, it tells us how important are the stories that we tell, right? So anyway, that's a long response to the question. Are there any other questions? Yeah, please.
Do you see any relationship to this Russia, Ukraine?
You know, I'm going to actually punt on this one. But the reason for that is, no, again, I think it's so important that you ask that question, right? Because I think it's so important that we provide you with an exhibit that says that, the past is relevant to thinking about stuff today. But I don't think that, we can basically tell you what that is, right? I think that it is definitely the case that we're seeing a kind of violation of sovereignty that is being justified through stories that are not true. And then again, I'll leave it to you to fill it out from there. Yeah. Any other questions? Please, easier than that. All right, well, thank you so much for letting me talk with you tonight.
Charles is always compelling, wonderful. He mentioned our next 3 talks, and I wanted to say that Gary Marmino is here. He will be speaking in October. We're looking forward to that. In June, the curator of the Frederick Remington Museum of Art will be speaking. And then in September, the curator of Columbia University's Library of Comics and Cartoons will be here. So please join us. Thank you for coming.